The morning air tasted like oil and dust. Engines thundered across the cracked tarmac, shaking the ground beneath the mechanic's boots, as wave after wave of B-24s lifted into the dark blue haze. 20 minutes into the flight, just after sunrise, one of them, a patched-up Liberator nicknamed Sweet Pea, lurched sideways in the tight southern formation, its left wing dipping low toward the olive groves. Inside, sweat clung to every surface. Grease-slicked panels vibrated beneath trembling boots. The smell of cordite, diesel, and burnt rubber clung to the skin. Staff Sergeant Al Grissom gripped a bulkhead bar near the rear hatch, his body bracing instinctively against the shaking floor. A wrench hung from his belt. He wasn't supposed to be on board, but after a last-minute crew swap and a faulty fuel gauge, they'd forced him to fly. Just for the first leg, the captain had muttered, in case something breaks. Something already had. A sharp metallic clack-clack echoed from beneath the fuselage. Not once, not twice, rhythmic, rising, unmistakable. The sound of pressure working its way under the gear doors. Grissom's eyes snapped to the floor. He knew that sound. He'd heard it before, standing on solid ground, watching another Liberator disintegrate mid-climb. A new vibration crept through the floor plates. It wasn't engine shake. It was something looser, more chaotic, wind tearing at the underbelly like invisible claws. Grissom shoved past the radio operator, ducked under the waist gunner's station, and yanked open the inspection panel with raw, shaking fingers. What he saw turned his gut cold. The left landing gear strut was jittering, just barely restrained by 2 bolts and a scrap of rope no thicker than his finger. The rope, his rope, held taut, trembling under the tension. If it snapped, if the gear dropped even half an inch, the door would catch airflow and swing open with explosive force. "Captain!" he barked into the intercom, but static roared in reply. They were already dropping to tree height. The ground surged up like a wave of earth and stone. Romanian forest flashed past beneath the wings. Grissom dropped to his knees, grabbing the rope with one hand, pressing the strut with the other. It screamed under pressure. His gloves slipped. One knot had already frayed. Every second, the pull increased. The sound outside thickened, deep, warbling thunder. Flak bursts. Black smoke puffs erupted ahead, their shock waves rattling the bomber like a tin sheet in a hailstorm. The nose gunner fired blindly. A second B-24 behind them peeled right, flames licking from its left engine before it slammed into a row of cypresses. No parachutes, no fireballs, just gone. Grissom didn't look back. Instead, he looped his elbow through a cable, pressed his weight into the panel, and stared at the rope. It creaked. One strand snapped. Just one. The sky was folding in. They were less than 2 minutes from the outer defense perimeter. Then, without warning, a jolt ran through the frame. Sharp, violent, final. Grissom gasped, certain the strut had blown free. But it hadn't. The rope held. He couldn't believe it. The damn rope held. He backed away, heart pounding so hard it drowned out the flak. The metal groaned, the air trembled, and the rope stretched to its limit, but it didn't break. The plane roared onward into fire. Grissom sat down in the belly of the bomber, slick with sweat, dizzy, deafened, clutching the torn edge of the hatch. Above him, the rope swayed in the wind, pulled tight between life and death. The base stank of exhaust and sweat. Metal clanged all night, echoing off canvas tents and oil-streaked hangars. Beneath the roar of engines and the barked orders of flight officers, something quieter crept in. Dread. Mechanics worked by lantern light, hands trembling over fuselage panels already patched 3 times too many. Bombers landed broken, if they landed at all. The men stopped asking names of the crews that didn't return. Officially, they were preparing for a strategic low-level bombing run. In truth, it was suicide. Operation Tidal Wave called for 178 B-24s to fly below radar, across enemy territory, and strike the Ploesti oil fields from tree level. Maps said the targets were heavily defended. Reality said something worse. 50,000 German and Romanian troops, hundreds of anti-aircraft guns, overlapping flak zones, camouflaged pillboxes, all pointed straight at the sky. And yet, that wasn't what kept Al Grissom awake. He'd been with the 98th Bomb Group for 9 months, patching wrecks and replacing engines with rust-bitten tools and stripped bolts. But no field order, no mechanical checklist, and no technical bulletin had ever addressed the real killer, the gear door failure. Every ground crew knew about it. Every pilot dreaded it. No one at HQ would admit it. The B-24's landing gear wasn't designed for low-level flight at combat speed. At 200 mph, close to the ground, crosswinds whipped under the thin aluminum belly and jammed air into every seam and crack. On some planes, the landing gear doors would vibrate open mid-run, disrupting airflow and causing catastrophic drag. If the gear deployed, even partially, the wind could twist the assembly until it tore free. The result was always the same: structural disintegration at altitude. Bodies in trees, burning metal in wheat fields. Silence on the radio. Inspection protocols were useless. The bolts held until they didn't. Some mechanics blamed old aircraft, others blamed field damage. Command blamed crew mishandling. Grissom had seen better. He'd seen a plane return with half its landing gear deployed, the pilot screaming into the mic, blood streaming from his co-pilot's shattered glass. He'd worked on a wreck so torn open the belly looked like a peeled sardine can, and in the wreckage of one downed bomber, he'd found a twisted door hinge jammed with a bolt sheared perfectly in two. Fatigue metal failure, not pilot error, not neglect. Just weak steel meeting strong wind. But no one above him listened. Requests for part upgrades were lost in paperwork. Replacements were rationed. Engineers at higher echelons chalked it up to combat variability. Grissom knew better. The problem wasn't theoretical, it was mechanical, and the cost was blood. He started keeping count. 17 B-24s had been pulled from the roster due to suspected mid-air gear door failures in just 3 weeks. That's 170 men, most of them now dead or listed as non-recoverable. And that was before the real mission began. Still, the orders came. Strip, check, recheck, sign off, send it flying. Mechanics raced through protocol with hollow eyes, some muttering prayers under their breath. Grissom kept quiet. He worked faster than the others, always triple-checking gear struts, reinforcing welds where he wasn't supposed to. But even that wasn't enough. One night, while patching Sweet Pea for its 4th sortie, he watched a junior mechanic yank a twisted strut into place with a rusted pipe. The boy wiped sweat off his face with a bandaged hand, unaware the part he just bent had hairline cracks from the last mission. That's when Grissom realized. Bolts couldn't stop this. Reinforcements wouldn't hold. The entire system was broken, and no regulation fix was coming, and the raid was only 6 days away. The desert wind swept through the tents, carrying the sharp tang of oil, dust, and exhaustion. Mechanics worked until their shadows blurred into the tarmac, their bodies bent under floodlights that flickered with every surge from the generator. Somewhere in the dark, a sergeant shouted about missing parts. Another cursed at a seized bearing. Grissom kept silent, sitting on an upturned crate beside a stripped B-24, watching a pile of landing gear assemblies gleam like bones in the half-light. He wasn't thinking about bolts or hinges anymore. He was thinking about leverage, about holding power, about resistance that didn't depend on steel. His hands were cracked from solvent, his eyes bloodshot from the fumes. But something small, almost laughable, tugged at the corner of his mind. It came from a simple sight. A supply jeep pulling up beside the hangar, stacked with ammunition crates tied down with rough army rope. Each knot held firm despite the jolt of the vehicle. The hemp strained but didn't give. When the truck hit a ditch, one of the crates shifted, then locked back into place under tension. It looked trivial. To Grissom, it wasn't. He stood up. The idea hit him with a clarity that drowned out everything. The engines, the shouting, the fatigue. It wasn't about reinforcing the metal. It was about stopping movement before it started. He scavenged a piece of frayed rope from the supply bin and cut it to length with a maintenance knife. It felt coarse and alive in his hands. The fibers bit his skin, leaving faint red lines across his palms. He ducked under the left wing of a grounded B-24 and slid into the gear bay, where the hydraulic arms hung still and cold. The air smelled like rubber and stale fuel. His flashlight beam jittered as he worked. He tied one end of the rope around the inner strut, looping it twice, then ran the other end through a bolt flange near the frame's edge. He left a few inches of slack, enough for the gear to deploy normally on takeoff, but short enough to lock it in place once airborne. A simple fail-safe, using tension instead of torque. It would keep the door flush against the belly. If pressure tried to force it open, the rope would resist with brute simplicity. He tested it by hand, pulling hard. The knot held. The strut didn't move. It was ridiculous. It was genius. It was illegal. If the rope jammed during landing, the pilot would crash. If it tore free, it could whip into the prop or shred the gear housing. Grissom knew all that, but he also knew what happened when they did nothing. He leaned back against the fuselage, breathing in the metallic chill of midnight. His hands shook as he retied the knot, this time tighter, cleaner. Then he added a small tag, scribbled words on torn paper from a ration slip. "Remove if fails." He tucked it into the assembly and stepped back. The hangar was silent except for the ticking of cooling engines. He could hear his pulse. Every instinct told him it was wrong, reckless, insubordinate, career-ending. Yet beneath that fear ran something stronger. Certainty. He repeated the process on 2 more aircraft, moving fast, crouched in shadows to avoid the patrolling MPs. The moonlight turned the rope pale, like bone against black steel. When he finished, his fingers were raw, and his uniform smelled of fuel and hemp. No one saw him leave the hangar that night. He didn't write a report, didn't tell the maintenance officer, didn't even mark the work order. But as he walked back toward the tent line, a strange calm settled over him. For the first time in months, he felt like he'd fixed something that might actually matter. And by dawn, 3 B-24s would carry that same forbidden rope into the sky. The first test came sooner than Grissom expected. A recon flight scheduled to chart the Yugoslav coast had lost its assigned mechanic to illness, and Grissom volunteered. 3 B-24s were slated to depart at sunrise, their bellies loaded with cameras instead of bombs. All 3 carried his rope fix, tied in secret beneath their gear bays. The risk was quiet, invisible, and all his. The engines came alive before dawn, their deep pulse rolling through the airfield like thunder trapped inside metal. Mechanics covered their ears. Grissom climbed aboard Barfly, the lead aircraft, his uniform streaked with grease and the smell of ethanol fuel still fresh on his skin. The air inside the fuselage felt thick, humid, alive with vibration. He tried not to stare at the floor panels where his idea waited to be tested. They lifted off smoothly, the desert shrinking below into pale dust and rippling heat. At 2,000 feet, the formation leveled, crossing into the open blue of the Adriatic. Every bolt hummed, every plate quivered. The airframe flexed and sighed like a living creature. Grissom crouched near the hatch, feeling for vibration. Nothing yet. Only the rhythm of engines and the dry rasp of wind scraping the fuselage. Halfway across the water, turbulence hit. The bomber shuddered violently, pitching to one side before the pilot corrected. A groan echoed from below, long, metallic, familiar. Grissom's stomach turned. He ripped open the access panel. Inside the bay, the rope was drawn taut, vibrating like a plucked string. The gear door quivered but didn't open. The knot held fast. He pressed his palm against it, feeling the strain hum through his bones. For 10 long seconds, nothing moved. Then the shaking stopped. Silence filled the hull. The gear stayed locked. When they landed 2 hours later, Grissom jumped down before the prop stopped spinning. He slid under the wing, eyes fixed on the gear door. The rope was stretched thin but intact. A few threads frayed at the knot, nothing more. He cut it loose with his knife, pocketed the end piece, and said nothing. 2 other planes rolled in behind, dust swirling around their wheels. Both had returned untouched, undamaged, 3 for 3. The numbers felt unreal. Later that day, one pilot came into the maintenance tent, pale with adrenaline. "Whoever rigged my gear tight, good work," he muttered, lighting a cigarette with shaking fingers. "I thought the doors jammed, but they held. Didn't even flutter." Grissom said only, "You got lucky." The man nodded, never realizing how literal that was. But word spread faster than fuel through a line. By dusk, crew chiefs whispered about a rope job that fixed the B-24's curse. Some thought it was myth. Others laughed, saying it sounded like field nonsense. Yet a few curious officers started asking questions, their tone sharper, suspicious. Unauthorized modifications were court-martial offenses. Grissom knew that as well as anyone. He began removing the tags he'd left on the planes, hiding evidence of the work. Still, the rumor kept growing. The next morning, a pilot from another squadron found a length of cord tied around his gear strut. He tore it off mid-flight after takeoff, shouting over the intercom that some fool had sabotaged his ship. Minutes later, one of his landing doors flapped loose, slamming against the fuselage so hard it ripped part of the hydraulic line free. They barely made it back to base. When they landed, smoke poured from the undercarriage, and the gear nearly collapsed on touchdown. The pilot, pale and shaking, found Grissom in the hangar hours later. He didn't yell this time. He just stared at the mechanic for a long, quiet moment, then muttered, "Whatever you did, keep doing it." Grissom said nothing. He only nodded, wiped the sweat from his brow, and walked back toward the hangar. Behind him, the engines of the next day's mission were already coughing to life, and the ropes, hidden in the dark bellies of the bombers, waited to face the real fire. Heat rolled through the hangars like waves off a furnace. Mechanics worked shirtless under the brutal sun, shoulders burned red, eyes bloodshot from sleepless nights. Tool carts rattled across concrete. Engines howled on test stands. And in the shadows of Tent 3B, a rumor hardened into reality. The rope trick was no longer a secret. Grissom was summoned without warning. 2 MPs stood outside his tent before dawn, their uniforms starched, their expressions unreadable. He followed them in silence to the operations shed, where 6 officers waited behind a folding table stacked with aircraft schematics, gear diagrams, and a torn length of parachute cord. No one introduced themselves. One captain shoved a clipboard forward and said, "Explain this." The knot was still in it. Grissom didn't flinch. He walked them through it. Loop tension, lateral pressure, fail-safe slack. Every word landed heavy in the stale air. No one interrupted. When he finished, the room stayed quiet until a major finally muttered, "It's insane." Another replied, "But it works." 12 bombers had flown with the fix. 12 came back. That was enough. By noon, the order was unofficially official. The rope mod was greenlit for immediate field use, but only under emergency authorization. They didn't call it Grissom's. They didn't even use his name. On the logistics manifest, it became Supplemental Gear Retention, Field Variant C. It sounded bureaucratic, but he recognized his signature loop in every diagram. The scramble began. 300 feet of surplus cord arrived by truck that afternoon, smelling of tar, dust, and ammonia from rushed dyeing. Mechanics swarmed the supply tent. Half had never tied anything more complex than a cargo hitch. Grissom trained them himself. Hands moved fast, fingers blistered, teeth clenched around cigarette filters as knots were yanked tight beneath the bombers' bellies. By midnight, nearly 80 B-24s were rigged. But then came problems. The rope supply ran low. Requisitioned cord had been diverted to a Navy depot by mistake. Field techs started improvising with parachute shrouds, tank tow lines, even braided electrical wire. Some worked, some didn't. One snapped during a test taxi and tore a gash in the rear wheel housing. Command panicked. Engineers demanded halt orders. Grissom refused. "Use real cord or don't tie it at all," he barked at a junior sergeant who tried to rig one with signal wire. The kid backed off. Sleep vanished. Meals disappeared. Tempers flared. But the knots kept going in. Officers from the 376th and 98th bomb groups began inspecting the work personally. A few grumbled. One called it Bush League engineering. But none pulled the mod once it was installed. They couldn't afford to. Every crew had heard the numbers now. Too many crashes. Too many blackened fields in Sicily, Corsica, and the Ionian coast. On the final night before the mission, 172 bombers sat in staggered rows across the airfield, moonlight glinting off their wings. Their bellies carried 500-pound bombs. Their doors, each one reinforced by a rope tied in secret hours ago, looked identical to the ones that had failed before. But something had changed. Grissom walked the line alone near midnight. His boots echoed on the cracked pavement. His fingers traced the edges of gear panels, checking each knot in the dark, testing tension by feel. The rope burned warm from the day's heat. It smelled like sweat, salt, and gasoline. At Bomber 146, a gunner leaned out of the side hatch. "This the famous fix?" he asked, tapping the hull. Grissom didn't answer. He just gave the strut one last pull, felt the rope flex and hold, then turned away. Somewhere behind him, a siren wailed, drill, not alarm. But the sound cut through the night like a warning. In less than 48 hours, those knots would face wind, fire, and steel. And if even one failed, hundreds would follow. The sky was gray and flickering when the first wave crossed the Danube. Thin mist curled around the engines, streaking the glass with condensation. Inside each bomber, the crew sat in tight silence, strapped in, hands slick with sweat. The cockpit smelled of metal and breath. Guns rattled as the planes dipped lower, sinking into a flight path that felt more like a fall than a glide. At 200 miles per hour, 30 feet above the ground, every vibration magnified. Grass blurred beneath the wings. The shadow of each B-24 ran like a ghost across the wheat fields, vanishing under trees, skipping over rivers, then reappearing on rooftops. The bombers were so low they kicked dust off the Romanian soil. The engines roared in unison, 12 cylinders each, pounding like fists against the air. Grissom wasn't flying this run. His job was done. He stood on the tarmac near the medic's truck, jaw locked, hands folded behind his back. He couldn't see the mission. He could only listen. The distant drone of engines, faint even in the open air, was the only sign they were still up there. Then the static hit. Radios came alive with broken chatter, one voice screaming over flak zones, another barking altitude corrections, a third stammering something about smoke. Command Control tried to answer, but everything dissolved into static and overlapping code. Someone yelled coordinates. Another cursed in 3 languages. Then a burst of silence that dragged too long. And then a whisper through the receiver. "Ropes held. We're still flying." In the sky, hell opened. Black puffs blossomed from hidden guns. Flak cracked the air with brutal percussion. Fire trails marked the wreckage of 2 lead bombers before the first target was even reached. Wingo Wango lost its right engine in a heartbeat, spun into a tree line, exploded before half the crew could bail out. The blast painted the soil red, but others pressed on. Their gear stayed up. One pilot reported a direct hit from a shell that peeled a panel off the belly but didn't dislodge the gear strut. Another flew through an updraft so violent it flipped a gunner into the bulkhead, but the ropes didn't snap. On spare parts, the port gear buckled from shock, but the rope locked it just high enough to miss the edge of a barn roof as they passed. Through smoke and fire, they made their runs. The refineries burned bright. Oil tanks ruptured and sent pillars of fire into the low sky. Pilots flew through the heat, eyes watering, fuselages blistering from the blast wave. Men leaned out of broken hatches to throw flares by hand when bomb release mechanisms failed. Every foot of altitude gained meant death. Every foot lost meant a chance of hitting the target, or the ground. But they kept flying. And still, not one report of gear deployment mid-run, no landing gear tearing loose, no doors slamming open into slipstreams, no planes shattered by their own flaws. Grissom's rope, stretched across steel, did what bolts and brass couldn't. By 0909, the first survivors limped back over the Adriatic. Smoke clung to their wings, fuselages stitched with holes, blood on the glass, radio silence from dozens, but dozens more returned. The first to land came in too fast, skidding on bald tires, belly sparks carving across the runway. The gear held. One tire blew on impact, but the leg stayed locked. The bomber bounced, veered, then straightened. The crew jumped out before the props stopped spinning. One of them, barely old enough to shave, kissed the nose of the plane and burst into tears. By noon, 54 planes were confirmed lost. Over 500 airmen killed or captured. The cost was catastrophic. But it could have been worse. Much worse. Because 340 men flew home in bombers that should have failed, and none of them ever knew their survival hung on a rope that cost $5. The airfield was quiet when the last survivors landed. Engines sputtered and died one by one, their final coughs echoing across the runway like dying breaths. Smoke drifted low over the hangars. Men stumbled out of cockpits barefoot, faces blackened, hands trembling from the vibration that still lived in their bones. The ground crews didn't cheer. They just stared. The raid was over, but the silence felt heavier than combat. Grissom stood at the edge of the runway, boots buried in dust, eyes fixed on the line of crippled bombers taxiing to their final rest. Some had bullet holes big enough to crawl through. Others had wings held together with tape and luck. Oil leaked across the ground in slow, shimmering puddles, the smell of burnt rubber mixed with cordite and scorched paint. When the first mechanic shouted that a gear leg had stayed locked despite direct flak hits, the others turned to look. Another bomber rolled in behind it, one tire shredded, both struts intact. The pattern repeated, battered fuselages, shredded wings, but gear doors sealed tight. Word spread fast through the line. The suicide gear had survived. Not one catastrophic door failure across the entire surviving fleet. No one said Grissom's name. Official reports credited mechanical reinforcement protocols. Engineers nodded at each other, proud of fixes they'd never designed. Grissom didn't care. He just watched as crews crawled out of their aircraft and collapsed on the ground, half laughing, half crying, kissing the dirt like men reborn. That night, under the dim orange lamps of the maintenance tent, Grissom unpacked a box of returned equipment, tools, manuals, empty oil tins. At the bottom lay a single length of rope, frayed, blackened, and fused with soot. Someone had scribbled across the tag in pencil, "Held through Ploesti." He turned it over in his hands, the fibers stiff with smoke. It smelled faintly of gasoline and sweat. He sat for a long time, elbows on his knees, staring at that rope. He thought of the men who hadn't come back, the ones whose planes burned before the target, whose names were already being copied onto the memorial roster. 54 bombers gone, 500 dead or captured. The mission had gutted entire squadrons. Command called it strategically valuable. The crews called it something else. When the debrief began the next morning, Grissom stood in the back of the room, silent. The colonel read statistics from a clipboard, his voice dry and distant. Damage reports, bomb impact zones, loss ratios, no mention of the field modification that had kept so many alive. To the higher-ups, it was just another line item on an engineering form. Improvised restraint device, field approved. But down in the tents, among the mechanics and gunners, the story changed. They started calling it the $5 miracle. Some tied small knots into their uniform sleeves. Others painted bits of cord on the nose art of their planes, a quiet salute to the man who'd refused to wait for orders. Grissom never joined the talk. He didn't pose for photographs or accept the commendation they eventually offered. He turned it down without a word. That evening, while others drank and shouted into the dark to keep the ghosts away, he sat alone behind the hangar, the rope in his hands, the sound of the raid still echoing faintly in his ears. He'd built it to stop movement, to hold what should never move again. But as the wind swept over the airfield, whistling through broken fuselages, he realized something else had shifted instead. The system had bent, the rules had cracked, and for once it had been a good thing. It hung behind glass, dull and forgotten. A scrap of rope, no longer than a forearm, its fibers singed and blackened by age. The tag tied to it was yellowed, corners curling upward, handwriting faded to near ghost. A small metal plaque below it read, "Improvised restraint device, Ploesti, 1943. No name, no citation, just the object, silent in its case. Visitors passed it without stopping. Most didn't notice the fray in the fibers, or the black scorch line running across the middle. It looked like nothing. But hidden in its twisted strands was a story not recorded in doctrine, not filed in any engineering blueprint, not logged in after-action reports. The innovation didn't survive on paper, but it survived in steel. By 1944, field manuals for bomber maintenance included a line buried deep in the appendices. Landing gear restraint mechanisms may be reinforced via flexible auxiliary arresters when operational context demands. No explanation, no origin, just protocol written in cold language. But every veteran mechanic who saw the note smiled. They knew where it came from. Grissom never spoke publicly about the rope. After the war, he returned to Ohio, opened a garage in a town too small to appear on most maps. He taught local kids how to fix tractors, how to listen for engine timing by ear, how to knot a length of cord so tight it could hold through fire. He married late, had no children, and when asked about the war, he only ever said, "I kept things running." But others remembered for him. Survivors from the 98th and 376th bomb groups wrote memoirs in their retirement. Some pages mentioned a field mod or miracle strap. One gunner described it as the last thing I saw before the world exploded. In a letter preserved at the Air Force Archive, a pilot scrawled, "We didn't know his name, just that someone, somewhere, gave a damn." Years passed. The war turned into textbooks, faces into photographs, the bombers into rusted relics on museum lawns. But every now and then, a veteran would visit the glass case in Dayton, lean close to the rope, and just stand there, breathing in its silence, remembering what it meant. In 1993, a research team excavating a crash site near Ploesti uncovered the partial frame of a B-24. Twisted beyond recognition, half sunk into the earth, riddled with rust. But wedged between two ribs of the gear housing, still fused to a bolt, was a length of burnt rope. It's not intact. They sent it to the museum without ceremony. Now it sits under fluorescent light, surrounded by larger artifacts. Engines, bombs, tail sections. It doesn't blink or gleam. It simply waits, the way it always did, for pressure to rise. And though no inscription says so, every strand in that rope once held the lives of men who never knew how close they came. Not with steel, not with orders, but with a $5 knot tied in the dark by a man who decided that enough was enough.